The Galactic Council chamber was filled with representatives from 1,000 different worlds, and Ambassador Zekthar of the Vryn Collective stood at the central podium with his 4 eyes gleaming as he looked at the assembled crowd, and his translator device converted his clicks and whistles into words that everyone could understand, and he began speaking with absolute certainty in his voice, and he announced that the human petition for membership had been reviewed and denied, and, furthermore, humanity had exactly 7 standard cycles to evacuate all 17 colony worlds they had established in the Outer Rim territories, and these colonies were considered illegal occupations by the Council, and the room hummed with agreement. From the other delegates, and Ambassador Claire Morrison sat in the human delegation section, with her hands folded calmly on the table in front of her, and beside her sat Lieutenant Commander Kyle Bennett in his crisp military uniform that looked very different from the flowing robes that most other delegates wore, and Claire felt the weight of what was happening, but she kept her face completely neutral and showed no emotion to the council members who were watching her closely. And when Zekthar finished his announcement, Claire stood up slowly with practiced grace, and she addressed the Vryn ambassador directly and said that those colonies had been established in completely unclaimed space according to the frontier settlement. Accords and humanity had every legal right to be there, and Zekthar's mandibles clicked together in what the translator interpreted as laughter, and he said the word rights with such contempt that it made several delegates shift uncomfortably, and he told Claire that humanity had only existed in space for barely 2 centuries, while the youngest civilization in that very chamber had been navigating the stars for 12,000 years, and humans had no rights, except those that the Council chose to grant them. And a murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber like a wave, and the Kethri delegate named Shesh spoke up next, and his crystalline body made sounds like breaking glass when he talked, and he said that human expansion had been far too aggressive and completely unchecked, and that humans bred too quickly and consumed resources too readily, and refused to acknowledge the established order that had existed for millennia. And Claire felt Kyle's hand briefly touch her elbow, which was his silent way of warning her to stay calm and not lose her temper. And she took a slow breath and addressed the council once more, and said that humanity had violated no laws, and attacked no one, and simply wished to exist and grow as was the right of any sentient species in the galaxy. And Zekthar replied that humans would continue to exist, but only within the boundaries that the Council set for them, and the 17 colonies would be redistributed to more deserving civilizations, and humanity would return to their origin system and remain there under Council supervision until they learned proper humility. And Claire asked what would happen if humanity refused, even though she already knew exactly what the answer would be. And Zekthar gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the center of the chamber, showing a massive fleet assembled at the edge of human space. And he said that the Council Armada would enforce compliance, and they had brought 12,000 warships to the human frontier, and humanity could surrender the colonies peacefully, or the Council would take them by force. And humans had 7 cycles to make their decision, and the session ended. And Claire walked with Kyle through the curved corridors of the massive council station, and her mind was racing with thoughts about what would happen next, and Kyle said quietly that the council was completely serious about this, and intelligence reports had confirmed the fleet composition. And there were actually 12,000 ships out there, and Claire only had maybe 300 ships in the entire human navy. And the odds were impossibly bad, and Claire replied that she knew the numbers perfectly well, and told Kyle to get her a secure communication channel to Earth immediately, because the president needed to hear this news directly from her. And back on Earth, deep beneath the city of Geneva, in a subterranean command center, President Daniel Carter received the transmission, and his expression was grim as he listened, and around the conference table sat all the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of Defense Linda Hayes and Director of Colonial Affairs Greg Palmer and Admiral Paul Jackson, studied the tactical display showing the Council fleet, and said that even with humanity's technological advantages, they would be facing odds of at least 40-1, and Secretary Hayes drummed her fingers on the table and said that the Council was counting on humanity to fold under pressure, and every projection said they should surrender, and every rational analysis said compliance was the only logical option. And President Carter leaned back in his chair with distant eyes and said that Humanity was not going to comply, and the room fell completely silent, and Admiral Jackson said, "Sir," with a questioning tone, and Carter clarified that he did not say they were going to fight, but rather that they were not going to comply. And there was a very important difference between those two things, and he asked Admiral Jackson about the status of Project Sentinel. And Jackson's eyes widened in surprise, and he said that Sentinel was not ready yet, and they needed at least another 6 months of preparation, and Carter said that the Admiral had 7 cycles, which was about 6 weeks in standard Earth time. And he stood up and placed both hands flat on the conference table and said that the Council thought they knew humanity, because they had read human transmissions and studied human history, and they thought humans were a young species that would bow down to overwhelming force. And his eyes became very hard, and he said that the Council was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you threaten humanity's children. And the determination in his voice made everyone in the room sit up straighter, and they all knew that something big was about to happen, and that the Council had made a terrible mistake by underestimating Earth. And Admiral Jackson nodded slowly and said he would make sure Project Sentinel was ready in time. And Carter said that humanity had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this kind of situation, and now it was time to show the galaxy what humans were truly capable of when pushed into a corner. And Secretary Hayes asked if he was certain about this course of action, because there would be no turning back once they committed. And Carter looked around the table at each person and said he had never been more certain of anything in his entire life. And humanity would not abandon their colonies, and would not surrender to threats, and would show the Council that humans were not prey animals to be herded and controlled. And the meeting continued late into the night as they planned their response. The 7 cycles passed with a strange and unsettling calm that made the Galactic Council increasingly nervous, and on the human colony worlds life continued exactly as it had before the ultimatum, and farms still produced their crops, and factories still ran their regular shifts, and children still attended their schools every day. And it was almost as if the threat of invasion had never been delivered at all. And Commander Zekthar sat in his flagship's war room, reviewing intelligence reports, and his confusion grew with each passing day, and he could not understand what the humans were doing, and there were no mass evacuations happening, and no panic in the streets, and no desperate fleet movements to defend the colonies. And his tactical officer Kess clicked thoughtfully and suggested that perhaps humanity truly intended to surrender peacefully, because their military presence in the colonies had actually decreased rather than increased, and many of their warships had returned to their home system around Earth. And Zekthar wondered if they were consolidating forces for some kind of last stand, and Kess said that seemed doubtful, because their intelligence reports suggested most human ships had entered orbital docks and appeared to be undergoing routine maintenance, and Zekthar felt a chill run through his entire carapace, though he could not explain why, and he ordered his officers to maintain constant surveillance because something felt very wrong about the whole situation. And meanwhile on Earth, the truth was completely different from what the Council's sensors were detecting, and deep beneath the surface of the moon, in massive shipyards that had been secretly carved from solid rock over the past 15 years, humanity's true response to the Council was taking shape, and Admiral Jackson stood on an observation deck, watching through thick, polarized windows as enormous construction bays hummed with constant activity, and the ships being built looked nothing like the sleek exploration vessels of humanity's current navy. And President Carter stood beside him and asked how many ships they had, and Jackson replied that at last count, there were 4,832 completed vessels, and another 200 would be finished before the deadline expired. And Carter shook his head in amazement and said 5,000 ships, and asked how they had managed to keep this project completely secret for so long, and Jackson explained that the lunar mining operations had been the perfect cover story, and for 15 years humanity had been telling everyone they were simply extracting resources and building infrastructure for future expansion, and they were doing exactly that, but not the kind that anyone expected. And every single ounce of titanium and every gram of exotic matter had been earmarked for Project Sentinel, and below them in the construction bays the warships gleamed under brilliant work lights, and they were blocky and brutal in design, with function prioritized over any aesthetic form. And each ship was somewhat smaller than the Council's massive dreadnoughts, but they were packed full of weapons and armor that incorporated every painful lesson humanity had learned from a full century of conflicts among themselves. And Lieutenant Sophie Grant approached them and saluted crisply, and reported that the last crew rotations were completing their final training sessions, and they would be fully staffed and ready within 3 days. And Carter asked about the weapon systems, and Sophie's expression became fierce as she explained that all railguns were charged and tested, and nuclear arsenals were loaded and properly secured, and the experimental plasma cannons had passed their final trials just yesterday. And she said with absolute confidence that they were ready, and on the colony world of New Helena, Governor Rick Chen stood on the balcony of the Capitol building, looking up at the night sky, and somewhere up there beyond the atmosphere, the Council Armada was waiting and watching, and all around him the city continued with its normal evening routine, and restaurants served dinner to families and theaters, showed films to audiences, and couples walked hand in hand through the beautiful parks, and his assistant Maya Brooks joined him on the balcony with a steaming cup of coffee, and said that you would never know they were standing on the edge of war. And Rick accepted the coffee gratefully and said that was exactly the point, and explained that the council thought humans were like sheep who would panic and flee at the first sign of real threat, and they did not understand that humans actually dig in harder when threatened, and humans do not run from their homes but instead defend them with everything they have. And Maya asked if that was true even when the odds seemed completely impossible, and Rick smiled and said especially then, and told her about what Admiral Jackson had said in the last secure briefing, which was that humanity has never been particularly good at mathematics when it comes to counting odds against them. And Maya laughed despite the tension and asked if it was really true what people were saying about Project Sentinel. And Rick replied carefully that he could not confirm specific details, but he could tell her that the military had been extremely busy for the past 15 years, and the council was about to receive the surprise of their lives, and aboard his flagship at the edge of human space, Commander Zekthar received the final countdown reports, and the deadline had officially passed with no evacuation, and no surrender, and no communication from humanity at all. And he said with a mixture of disbelief and annoyance that the humans were actually going to make the council use force, and he gave the order to signal the entire fleet, and said they would begin with New Helena as a demonstration, and surely that would bring the other colonies into line quickly. And the Council Armada began its advance with 12,000 warships moving in perfect military formation toward the nearest human colony, and Zekthar expected to see panic and desperate pleas for mercy and perhaps some token resistance from the few human vessels in the system. But what he got instead was complete and total silence, and the human ships in orbit around New Helena simply powered up their engines and withdrew toward the outer system without even attempting to defend the planet. And the orbital stations went dark as if they had been completely evacuated, and Kess muttered that the humans were cowards who were abandoning their own people. And Zekthar felt that chill again, but much stronger this time, and said that something was very wrong, and asked where the planetary defenses were, and where were the ground-to-space batteries, and why would humans build expensive colonies and not bother to fortify them properly. And the answer came suddenly and terribly as his fleet entered high orbit around New Helena, and every sensor on every single ship began screaming urgent warnings all at once, and the tactical display lit up with thousands and thousands of red threat markers appearing from behind the moon, and from within the asteroid field, and from the upper atmosphere of the nearby gas giant. And they were ships and human ships, and far more ships than should have been remotely possible for such a young species. And Zekthar roared for a status report, and Kess reported in a voice high with panic that they were detecting new contacts and counting 4,000 and then 5,000, and the estimate was over 5,000. 200 capital warships, and Kess asked in shock where they had come from, and the council fleet sat frozen in space as they realized they had flown directly into a trap. The crew of the ESS Valkyrie worked with practiced efficiency as their ship, fresh from the secret lunar shipyards, took its assigned position in the massive human formation, and Captain Lisa Brooks sat in the command chair with her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests tightly, and her executive officer, Commander Nathan Price, announced that all stations were reporting ready, and weapons were hot and shields were at maximum power, and the reactor was running at 110% output. And Lisa asked about fleet communications, and Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the communications officer, patched the signal through to the main speakers so everyone on the bridge could hear, and Admiral Jackson's voice filled the bridge, sounding calm and measured. despite the enormous battle that was about to begin, and he said that all ships should remember this was the day they had trained for, and everyone knew their assignments, and he reminded them that the Council ships had only ever fought against primitives and pirates, and they had never faced a unified human fleet, and had never faced humans when they were truly angry. And on the tactical display, the human fleet was organized into tight strike groups with each one commanded by experienced officers who had learned their skills fighting off raiders and resolving Earth's last corporate wars, and the formation was deliberately aggressive and designed for overwhelming force rather than elegant tactical maneuvering. And Admiral Jackson continued speaking and told them to show the Council what Earth builds when humanity is threatened, and to show them exactly why you do not threaten humanity's future. And he gave the order for all ships to execute Battle Plan Hammer, and said they would send a message that the entire galaxy would hear. And aboard the Council flagship, complete chaos had taken over, and Commander Zekthar's 4 eyes darted rapidly between multiple displays as he tried desperately to make sense of what he was seeing, and he demanded to know how this was even possible, and said that their intelligence had clearly shown only 300 human ships total, and wanted to know where 5,000 vessels had come from, and Kess replied with a cracking voice that the answer was unknown, and the humans must have been building them in complete secrecy, and the real question now was what the Council fleet should do. And Zekthar's warrior instincts fought against his tactical training, and he realized that he still had numerical superiority of more than 2 to 1, and these were not the lightly armed exploration vessels his intelligence reports had promised, but these were real warships that had been purpose-built for battle, and he decided they would proceed with the attack, and ordered all ships to maintain formation and advance because they still outnumbered the humans significantly. And the 2 massive fleets began closing the distance, and the first shots were fired, and the Council ships opened up with their plasma lances, which were beautiful streams of superheated gas that crossed the void in elegant glowing arcs, and the human response was brutally and shockingly different, and railgun slugs accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed tore through space, and when they impacted Council shields, the kinetic energy had to go somewhere, and shields flickered and failed under the constant hammering, and nuclear-tipped missiles followed close behind, and the void lit up with dozens of miniature suns, and Captain Brooks watched as her ship's guns spoke with authority, and the Valkyrie shuddered with each railgun volley, and she could actually feel the intense heat through the deck plating as the plasma cannons cycled through their firing sequence, and her weapons officer, Lieutenant Owen Phillips, reported with satisfaction that their target was destroyed and the Cathari cruiser was breaking apart, and he was already switching to the next target. And Nathan called out that multiple incoming shots were detected and told everyone to brace for impact, and the Council's return fire splashed across Valkyrie's shields, and warning lights flashed across every station on the bridge. But the shields held strong and human defensive technology that had been developed through decades of paranoid planning. For the worst absorbed the punishment, and the engineering officer reported that shields were at 60%, and they could take a few more direct hits, and Lisa smiled grimly and said they should make sure they did not have to take any more hits, and told Owen to target that formation of light cruisers and fire a full broadside, and in the first hour of battle, the Council learned exactly what human weapons could do. And railguns that never missed their targets were guided by computers that could predict evasive maneuvers before they happened, and missiles adapted their approach patterns on the fly using artificial intelligence, and plasma weapons burned hotter than any Council equivalents because they were powered by fusion reactors that Earth scientists had perfected through trial and terrible error. But more than just the weapons, it was the tactics that shocked the Council forces, and human ships fought with a ferocity that seemed almost suicidal. And they would deliberately absorb enemy fire to get into close range, and then unleash everything they had in devastating volleys, and ship captains made critical decisions in mere seconds that Council commanders would have spent minutes debating. And Captain Lisa Brooks demonstrated this perfectly when a Council dreadnought targeted her ship, and instead of evading, she ordered full speed ahead, directly toward the enemy vessel, and Nathan protested that they could not survive a direct engagement with a dreadnought, and Lisa replied that they did not need to survive it, but just needed to win it, and ordered all power diverted to forward shields, and told her weapons officer that she wanted every gun they had ready to fire the exact moment they reached optimal range, and the Valkyrie charged straight down the dreadnought's throat with its shields blazing as they absorbed the incoming fire, and warning alarms screamed throughout the ship and the deck shook violently and crew members gripped their stations as the artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. And then they were in close range, far too close for the dreadnought's main guns to track effectively, and Lisa ordered them to fire everything. And at point-blank range, the Valkyrie's railguns punched through the dreadnought's weakened shields and deep into its hull, and the plasma cannons followed immediately after, carving molten scars across the enemy's armor plating, and nuclear missiles impacted seconds later. And the dreadnought's reactor containment failed catastrophically, and the enemy ship died in a massive flash of light that forced the view screens to automatically polarize, and the Valkyrie emerged from the explosion trailing atmosphere and debris and scarred, but still functional. And Lisa called for a damage report and was told that forward shields were completely gone, and there were hull breaches on decks 4 through 7, and Reactor 2 was offline, but they were still in the fight. And Lisa allowed herself a brief smile and said, then they should find another target, and across the entire battlefield, similar scenes played out hundreds of times, and human ships fought with desperate courage, knowing that every council vessel they destroyed was one less threat to the colonies below. And the void between New Helena and its moon became a massive graveyard of shattered ships from both sides. And Commander Zekthar watched his tactical advantage evaporate before his eyes, and for every human ship destroyed, his fleet was losing 2 or 3 vessels, and the mathematics were brutal and completely undeniable. And he ordered a fleet-wide withdrawal, saying they needed to regroup and reassess the situation. And as the Council fleet retreated, Admiral Jackson allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, because the first engagement had gone to humanity. But he knew this was only the beginning. News of the battle at New Helena spread through the Galactic Council like fire through dry grass, and the impossible had actually happened, and humanity, the upstart species that had barely been in space for 2 centuries, had not only refused to surrender, but had defeated the largest armada the Council had assembled in 500 years. And on the Council homeworld of Zendara, emergency sessions were called immediately, and Ambassador Zekthar found himself standing before the full Council assembly, no longer the confident voice of dominance, but now a military commander trying to explain a catastrophic failure. And High Counselor Dreth repeated the number 5,000 ships, and her crystalline form pulsed with angry red light, and she said that Zekthar had told them humanity possessed only 300 vessels total, and he had assured everyone this would be a simple enforcement action. And Zekthar defended himself by saying their intelligence had been accurate based on all observable data, and explained that the humans had hidden their shipyards on the far side of their moon deep beneath the surface, and they had built this entire fleet in complete secrecy over 15 years, and the Cathari delegate Shesh chimed in with his voice like breaking ice and said 15 years, and asked if Zekthar was really telling them that humans who the Council had monitored constantly had managed to build a fleet 4 times larger than their known navy without anyone noticing. And Zekthar explained that they had used their mining operations as the perfect cover, and every sensor reading had shown legitimate resource extraction, and all the energy signatures had matched expected patterns, and the humans had been clever, and far more clever than anyone had given them credit for. And High Counselor Dreth's form flickered through several colors before settling on cold blue. And she said the question now was what they should do about this situation, and they had lost 3,000 ships in a single battle against an enemy they had thought was primitive. And in a corner of the chamber, Ambassador Claire Morrison sat with a small, satisfied smile on her face, and Kyle Bennett beside her leaned over and whispered, asking if she thought they were ready to negotiate now, and Claire replied softly that maybe they were. But first, humanity needed to make sure the Council understood the full picture of the situation, and she rose from her seat and requested permission to speak. And the chamber fell completely silent as every eye and sensor and attention, focused directly on her and Claire, began by saying that she believed there had been a fundamental misunderstanding about humanity, and explained that the Council had looked at humanity's short history in space and assumed they were children playing at civilization, and had seen the small fleet, and thought humans were weak, and had demanded surrender of the colonies, and expected complete compliance. And she paused to let her words sink in deeply, and continued by saying that the Council had failed to understand what truly drives humanity, and said that humans had fought for survival since they lived in caves and had faced extinction events and plagues and wars and disasters, that would have ended lesser species, and every single time humanity had adapted, and every time they had survived, and every time they had come back even stronger than before. And High Counselor Dreth asked coldly what her point was, and Claire said that her point was that the fleet the Council had faced at New Helena, with its 5,000 ships that had destroyed the Council, armada was not humanity's entire strength, and it was just what they had ready to deploy immediately. And the chamber erupted in disbelief, and shocked voices filled the air. And Claire waited patiently for the noise to die down before continuing. And she explained that for 15 years, while the Council watched and judged them, humanity had prepared, and not because they wanted war, but because they had learned long ago that peace is only possible from a position of strength. And she said the shipyards on the moon were still operating, and every week they produced more vessels, and that was just the lunar facilities. And she brought up a holographic display showing the inner solar system of Earth, and pointed out that humanity had construction facilities in orbit around Mars and fabrication, plants in the asteroid belt, and automated factories on the moons of Jupiter. And all of them were building ships and had been doing so for years. And Kyle added his own data to the display, and said that current estimates placed the active human fleet at 8,000 vessels, with another 3,000 in various stages of construction, and by this time next year humanity would have 15,000 ships, and they would keep building more. And the Council sat in stunned silence. And finally, Shesh spoke with his voice like breaking ice, and said that what Claire was describing was an arms race, that the Council could not win. And Claire corrected him, and said no. She was saying it was an arms race that never needed to happen in the first place, and humanity had not wanted this, and had wanted to join the Council and contribute to galactic civilization and be partners in exploring and settling the galaxy. But the Council had chosen confrontation, and issued ultimatums, and brought an armada to humanity's doorstep, and threatened their children. And she looked around the chamber, meeting each delegate's eyes in turn, and said that humanity could be the Council's greatest ally or their worst nightmare, and humans would prefer the former, but if the Council insisted on the latter, then they should understand that humanity would not surrender and would not retreat, and would fight for every colony and every world and every life, and humans would win because that is what humans do. And on Earth. President Carter watched the transmission from the Council chamber with satisfaction, and beside him Admiral Jackson reviewed the latest fleet status reports, and Carter observed that Claire was doing very well, and asked if Jackson thought the Council would accept the peace terms, and Jackson replied that they would be fools not to accept, but pride makes fools of everyone sometimes, and they needed to be ready in case the Council decided to escalate further. And Carter asked about the status of the reserve fleets, and Jackson explained that 2nd Fleet was deployed to New Victoria, and 3rd Fleet was guarding New Dublin, and 4th through 9th Fleets were stationed throughout all the colonial systems, and 1st Fleet remained at Earth guarding the homeworld itself. And he pulled up a tactical map showing all the deployments, and said they were as ready as they could possibly be. And Carter nodded slowly, and said that when they had started Project Sentinel, he had nightmares about what would happen if they actually had to use it. And now that they had used it, he realized the real nightmare would have been not building it at all. And if they had been caught unprepared with only those 300 ships, they would be evacuating the colonies right now. And Jackson finished the thought by saying or fighting a losing battle against impossible odds, and instead they were dictating terms, and it was amazing what 15 years of paranoid preparation could accomplish. And on New Helena, Governor Rick Chen stood in the city square where thousands of colonists had gathered, and the debris in orbit was still being cleared, and the scars of battle were visible even from the ground, but the people were celebrating instead of mourning. And Rick addressed the crowd and said that today they had proved something important, and they had proved that humanity would defend its own, and that they do not abandon colonies when threatened, and that they stand together as one species and one people. And the crowd erupted in cheers. 3 weeks after the Battle of New Helena, the Galactic Council reconvened, and this time the atmosphere in the chamber was markedly different, and where before there had been arrogance and certainty, now there was caution and careful consideration. And Ambassador Claire Morrison entered the chamber flanked by Admiral Jackson, who wore his full dress uniform decorated with medals from Earth's various conflicts, and the Council had specifically requested his presence, which was a tacit acknowledgement that this was now a military matter as well as a diplomatic one. And High Counselor Dreth called the session to order, and announced that the council had deliberated extensively on the human situation, and they had reviewed all the battle data and assessed their losses and considered their options carefully, and Claire remained standing with her posture relaxed but alert, and Kyle Bennett sat at the human delegation desk ready to provide any support that might be needed. And Dreth continued by saying that the council acknowledged their initial assessment of humanity's capabilities had been flawed, and they had underestimated both human military strength and human resolve. And Admiral Jackson said dryly that this was certainly one way to put it. And a ripple of discomfort went through the assembled delegates because no one had ever addressed the council with such casual disrespect before. But after what humanity had demonstrated in battle, no one dared to challenge him. And Shesh chimed in with his crystalline voice sounding more moderate than before, and said the question before them was how to proceed, and they had several options, and they could escalate by calling upon the full military resources of all member species, but intelligence suggested that would be extremely costly and potentially futile, given humanity's demonstrated production capacity. And Jackson confirmed that it would be very futile indeed, and said they had run the simulations, and even if the council mobilized every single warship in council space, they were looking at a protracted conflict they simply could not win. And he explained that human shipyards outproduced council shipyards by a factor of 3, and human crews trained constantly in realistic combat scenarios. And the council would win some battles, but they would ultimately lose the war. And Ambassador Zekthar, who had been silent until now, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully and said there was another option. And it was the one Ambassador Morrison had suggested 3 weeks ago, which was peace with humans as full council members. And Claire asked if that was what the council wanted and directed her question to everyone present, and said she needed to be very clear about humanity's terms and explained that humans wanted full membership with voting rights, equal to any other species. And they wanted recognition of all 17 colonies as legitimate human territories, and they wanted trade agreements, and technology sharing and cultural exchange, and they wanted to be partners and not subjects. And Dreth asked what humanity would offer in return, and Claire replied that in return, humans would contribute their strength to council security, and human ships would help patrol trade routes and human technology would be shared freely, and human scientists would collaborate with alien researchers, and humanity would be constructive members of galactic civilization. And her expression hardened as she continued and said that the council must understand that humanity would never again accept ultimatums and would never surrender their sovereignty and would defend their interests with the same ferocity they had shown at New Helena. And the council chamber fell silent as all the delegates considered this, and finally Dreth spoke and said the council would need to vote on full membership. But she believed she spoke for many when she said that humanity had earned its place among them, if not through wisdom, then certainly through strength. And Claire said with a slight smile that they would take that, though she would argue it took considerable wisdom to prepare for this eventuality, and over the next several hours the details were hammered out carefully and treaties were drafted and boundaries were confirmed and the framework for human integration into council society was established, and it was not perfect, and there were compromises on both sides, but it was workable. And as the session concluded, Zekthar approached Claire and Jackson and said that he owed them an apology because he had underestimated them very badly, and Claire replied that he had underestimated all of humanity, but she appreciated the acknowledgement and said that for what it was worth she hoped this could be the beginning of genuine cooperation, and Zekthar agreed, and said though he suspected his military career was over after this debacle, and Jackson clapped him on the shoulder, which was a gesture that clearly startled the Vryn commander, and said that Zekthar should look at it a different way, because he was now the general who had survived first contact with humanity, and that was going to make him very valuable as an advisor on human military doctrine, and he might have a whole new career ahead of him. And back on Earth, President Carter stood in the Oval Office looking out at the night sky, and the moon was visible, and he knew that beneath its surface the shipyards continued their work just in case. And Secretary Hayes entered carrying a tablet and announced that the council vote had just come through, and humanity had been granted full membership status, and all colonies were recognized, and trade agreements were pending ratification. And Carter nodded slowly and asked about the fleet, and Hayes replied that Admiral Jackson recommended they maintain their current production schedule for the next 5 years, and then scale back to sustainable levels. because he did not trust the council not to try something else once they had rebuilt their forces, and Carter said that Jackson was a smart man and told her to approve the recommendation and make sure their shipyard locations remained classified, and let the council wonder where human ships came from. And Hayes confirmed it was already done, and Carter turned from the window and said that when this started, he had been terrified. They had made the wrong choice, and that refusing to evacuate the colonies would lead to disaster. But now he realized that showing weakness would have been the real disaster, and Hayes observed that humanity had always responded poorly to bullying, and the council had learned that lesson the hard way, and, on New Helena, life slowly returned to normal, and the debris in orbit had been cleared away, and the damaged ships had been repaired or replaced, and the scars on the planet's surface where council weapons had struck during the brief battle were being transformed into monuments to honor the fallen. And Governor Rick Chen stood at one such monument where the names of 300 colonists who had died in the battle were inscribed on black stone, and Maya Brooks stood beside him holding a wreath of local flowers, and Rick said quietly that 300 lives was the cost of freedom. And Maya replied that they had known the risks, and everyone on the colonies had known that refusing to evacuate might lead to war, and they had chosen to stay anyway, and Rick said it was because this was home and humans defend their homes, and above them, a squadron of human warships passed overhead on patrol, and their sleek forms cut through the atmosphere with a sonic boom that echoed like protective thunder. And in the years that followed, humanity's integration into the Galactic Council continued steadily, and human ships patrolled alongside council vessels, and human scientists collaborated with alien researchers, and human diplomats learned the intricate politics of galactic civilization. But the shipyards on Luna never stopped their production, and the fleets continued to grow, and the military trained constantly, running exercises that pushed crews and ships to their absolute limits, because the lesson of the Council's ultimatum had been learned and would never be forgotten. And in the vast darkness of space, the only true security was the ability to defend yourself, and the only real guarantee of peace was the strength to wage war if necessary. And when the Council looked at humanity now, they no longer saw a young species to be bullied and controlled, but instead they saw equals and partners, and if necessary, the most dangerous warriors in the entire galaxy. And the Council had anticipated humanity's surrender, but instead Earth's warships had filled the skies, and nothing would ever be the same again.